Learning by doing. This one's pretty interesting for me. I was an athlete. I swam from 7 to 26, and uh, my whole experience was around this specifically. I always thought that how I learned was by seeing someone do it and then essentially copying their movements, right? So, for example, in swimming, obviously, I was always looking to the Michael Phelps, Ryan Lochte, those type of guys, and I would try to kind of copy their stroke, right? Because in swimming, there's definitely a lot of emphasis on technique, but nobody really knows what the best technique is. There's all this like, well, it's this technique is good for this person, this technique is good for this person. But if we really look at it with self-honesty, uh, we all have the same limbs, right? Now some are longer than others, right? But they all function in the same type of way, right? So there's hydrodynamics in terms of how the actual human physical body can move through it in the most efficient manner, depending on whatever stroke is there. And so I didn't learn about any of that until I was 24 years old. I only learned from the coaches who had just learned from copying the Michael Phelps or the best swimmer, and they would just kind of say, "Okay, well, pattern recognition. This is what he's doing. Let's copy that, and this is how it'll work." And swimming has gotten marginally better over time, but the whole point of it, right, is to look at how you're learning specifically. And I wanted to play this because it really hits a good point around music and the point of learning by doing.
Experiential learning is also believed to be responsible for the fact that musicians generally fare better at most tests, regardless of what they measure. People that practice an instrument not only engage their brain in motor, visual, and auditory areas, but they also learn by reflecting on what they're doing with a fast feedback loop. A wrong tone on the violin sounds too terrible to remain unnoticed. While playing, they therefore not only learn to make music, but also that progress in general comes through practice, reflection, understanding, and repetition.
So, those points again, basically, the idea of learning through doing is practice, right? Reflection. So, I got in the pool, I swam this race. How could I swim better next time? You're reflecting on it. Okay, well, I could have uh, breathed less, right? I could have jumped off the wall quicker, could have done a flip turn faster. In music, right? I could have held my elbow up a little bit higher and held that technique a little bit longer. I could have held that note just a little bit longer before I switched to the other one. I jumped the note too quick, so that's kind of reflection. Um, Understanding is kind of the you're putting things together and you're like, okay, cool, that is the breakthrough. That's what I didn't do, right? Um, and then you're doing it over again, repetition, and trying to fix and correct through that breakthrough, right? But that breakthrough, right, is all you're doing is you're putting two pieces together, so or more, right? You're saying, okay, if I would have in the song held that note for just a little bit longer before jumping over, then that's what I'm looking for with my ear, right? And so all those things are concepts boiled down to actual words themselves. So what I realized, right, was when people say, "Oh, I just learned through doing," right? I had a guy say this yesterday about basketball. He goes, "Well, I learn from doing. I can watch him do it, and then I can replicate it, and that's how I kind of learn." I said, "Okay, that's great, but have you ever watched Michael Jordan?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, can you dunk like Michael Jordan?" And he said, "Well, no, I don't have those abilities, right? I don't have those abilities." I'm like, "Yeah, okay, but if you did the practice with the already breakthroughs that Michael Jordan had without you having to learn them yourself, and you implemented those before you actually did the practice, do you think that would be a little bit easier to learn?" right? And he said, well, yeah, sure. I guess that kind of makes sense. So at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing around even learning by doing, you're still learning through the process of taking in information, internalizing it, if you have a place to actually even internalize it, and that's a whole nother story. But um, if you do have that place to internalize it, meaning you know what the coach is telling you to do, you know what Michael Jordan is meaning by the words that he's explaining to you, then you can effectively do those things, right? But the reason why this guy couldn't necessarily um, replicate exactly what he had is he didn't have the knowledge that Michael Jordan has through probably experience and coaching, stuff like that. But also, he didn't have a place to even internalize it. So the best he can do is essentially watch and replicate, mimic the pattern, um, to do the best that he can do with that knowledge and with what he's already internalized. So even the idea of learning by doing, there is still a process of internalizing information, um, and hence why having a spot to internalize that is so important. So I just thought that was very interesting. Like it kind of stumped me when he was saying it, in terms of learning by doing. I had to really sit there and kind of process that, because that's what I had always looked at as, oh, I just learned by doing, right? But through swimming, right, it took me 26 years to even learn that there was such thing as hydrodynamics for human beings, meaning an actual science around how a human can go through the water in the most efficient manner, just like a boat, right? They have science behind. That's why you see these boats that are like this, right, underneath, because that's the most efficient way to go through the water, right? The speedboats that are extremely cut tight like that. Um, and you can do the same thing with a human being. I did not have that knowledge, right? And what's crazy, even more crazy, is once I got that knowledge, I didn't have a place to put it within me because from age 7 to 20 something, right? I had been only learning the specific terms that I had learned up to that point, or the specific techniques up to that point. So even when I learned this whole thing, the only way I could implement it, right? For example, bending your elbow at 90 degrees underneath yourself, right? I could not implement that because I'd always swam like this. So my body did not even know how to do it. And I had to do this millions of times in the water to even get close. And still my body wanted to go back here. So it's pretty interesting, right? If you don't actually have the spot to internalize it, but then on top of that, if you don't realize that you can actually take the real common sense applied knowledge of how to effectively do those things and then implement them. And imagine how quickly or more quicker you can learn through that process.